Hello, my name is Sylvia Liska Durrell. I live in Hernando County, Florida, and am a founding member of the Hernando County Button Collectors Group, which is a study group of the Manatee Button Club in Ocala, Florida. I am also a member of the National Button Society Publicity Committee and am Publicity Chair for Florida State Button Society. The Hernando County Button Collectors Group is just a couple of years old, so many of us are still novices in button collecting. That is why we try to include a lot of education in our monthly meetings. I recently researched bone buttons and shared the info with my button group members. I hope you had a chance to view my part 1 of this series on bone buttons. How do you tell if it's made of bone? If not, look for it here on YouTube. Now let's get on to part 2. I'm going to cover the making and use of bone buttons. Bone is not considered to be a major button material. However, there are things to like about bone for buttons. Bone can be shaped by cutting or turning as on a lathe. It takes a fine polish. It dies perfectly. And it has a good surface for painting, stenciling, or transferring. Things button makers don't like about bone: its restricted size. They can have an uneven texture that ranges from firm to porous. There is a lack of elasticity. Bone will neither bend nor compress, so it can't be stamped. It has a poor resistance to abrasion and heat. And bone's humble origin. Fashionistas have decided it is unacceptable merely out of snobbery. It's been documented that bone buttons were first used to fasten garments in the 12th century France, and that bone buttons were made by French bead makers in the 14th century. Some bone buttons were elaborately carved to look like ivory. Bone buttons were often constructed in the home during the 17th and 18th centuries. The bones were boiled for 10 or 12 hours until they were soft enough to be sliced into small round pieces, and then holes would be punched into them. Or if bigger sizes of bones were available, a circular saw was used on the flatter pieces to cut out the button blanks or molds. These were polished, and holes were drilled into the body to create sew-throughs. Button molds were made during the Revolutionary War by American soldiers. These bone molds were covered with cloth. Examples of these have been excavated at Revolutionary War campsites. I found my bone button molds, they're pictured here with the green background, in a jar of bone underwear buttons. I can't tell you when these were made. The bone buttons new collectors think of first are the everyday kinds intended for underwear, pants, suspenders, or other utility purposes. The common buttons used on this piece of button art range in sizes from 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch. For a long time, button collectors ignored these plain and ordinary buttons. Bone buttons were made in 2-hole and 4-hole styles, as well as the scarcer ones with 3, 5, and the whistles with 1 hole on the top. The centers may be flat, convex, or concave, and they may have rims that are flat, rolled, or sloped, wide or narrow. Years ago, button collectors were crazy happy to find any button with 5 holes. Then button counterfeiters learned how easy it was to add a 5th hole to any 4-hole button, specifically to fool a collector. If you have doubts about a 5-holed button, look for signs of fresh whiteness inside the hole to see if it was bored recently, or if you can see a dark stain that was made by a hot needle or awl. Another way is to look for the raised rim around the 5th hole. That is positive proof that it is original. Just remember, these original 5-holers are hard to find. Sometimes the plain buttons were totally flat, but usually a center circle, including the holes, was recessed, leaving a raised border. The bone buttons shown are from the box also pictured here. I found this box at an estate sale. They are uniform in size, leading me to believe they were punched out with more modern machinery. You can still see a not so clean punch on the one on the right. Bone buttons like these continued to be used well into the 19th century. I know you have heard the horrible story of how the American bison population was intentionally killed off. About 1 billion bison were brutally killed for sport, as well in effort to take over Western territories from Native Americans. It is said that bison bones covered the ground for miles and miles. Hundreds of merchants in the West established regular trade in bison bones. A lot of the bone was used for making bone buttons. It didn't take long for all the bones from Missouri to the Rockies to be gone. Between 1868 and 1881, more than $2.5 million worth of bones were shipped out of Kansas alone, and the bone business was a major industry, especially for Dodge City. On the flip side of that, Jacob Ammon, the founder of the religion from which the sect of Pennsylvania Amish Mennonites was developed, forbade his followers to wear any buttons. His reason was that all the buttons found in the Alps region in the 17th century were made of the bones of slaughtered animals, something he didn't believe in. This custom is still maintained. The Amish Mennonites are sometimes called the Hook and Eye Mennonites. That's all for part 2, the making and use of bone buttons. Look for part 3, on which I will talk about what bone button collectors look for. Thanks for your interest.